I had always looked forward to my vacations at my grandfather's farm. It was a tradition I cherished, spending time with him in the quiet countryside. My grandfather and I were very close, and I loved helping him with the farm chores. Whether it was taking care of the animals or harvesting the crops, I felt at home in the fields. One day, my grandmother decided she wanted to make a corn cake, and that meant we had to harvest the corn. My grandfather and I were tasked with picking the ears of corn, and even though it was getting late, he didn't seem to mind. The sky was already darkening, but the task needed to be done. As we worked, I could feel the warmth of the setting sun on my back, but the air was still thick with the smell of fresh earth. The evening was peaceful, and it seemed like everything was going as usual, just another night on the farm. My grandmother had told us to wait until the morning to harvest, but my grandfather, always eager for that corn cake, insisted we get started right away. So with a sense of calm, he called me to join him. The moonlight was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the field, but I didn't think much of it. We gathered a few dozen ears of corn, ready to head back when we heard something that would change everything. When we arrived at the cornfield, the moonlight bathed the plants in an eerie glow. The corn was ripe, heavy on the stalks, just waiting to be harvested. The field stretched out before us, and as my grandfather and I worked together, picking the corn, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. It was the kind of quiet only the countryside could offer, but that peace was short-lived. Suddenly a sound broke through the stillness. Hooves, the unmistakable sound of a horse walking through the corn. My grandfather froze, his eyes narrowing. We both listened carefully, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. He was clearly puzzled, and I could feel the tension building. "If that's a horse, it'd eat all the corn," he muttered, a note of concern in his voice. I turned to him, watching as he scanned the field, his hand resting on the handle of his scythe. It wasn't like him to be worried about something like this. The horse must have been close, but neither of us could see it. It was strange, everything about the sound felt wrong. Then, out of nowhere, a figure emerged from the shadows of the cornfield. A man appeared riding a horse, as if he had come from the very heart of the crops. He nodded at us, a brief acknowledgement, and continued walking past us. His presence felt odd, like he didn't belong there. My grandfather's confusion deepened as he watched the man move toward the road, disappearing into the night. My grandfather stood still, staring after the man as he rode off. He couldn't understand where he had come from or why he was out there in the middle of the night, riding through the cornfield. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the same confusion I was feeling deep inside. I tried to shake off the chill that had crept over me, but it was hard to ignore the unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach. I didn't want to show it, but I was scared. There was something off about the whole situation. The man, the way he appeared out of nowhere, his strange comments, it all felt wrong. I forced myself to look away, pretending that everything was fine, but my eyes kept darting back to the figure walking slowly down the road. He didn't seem to be in any hurry, almost like he was lost. My grandfather muttered to himself, still watching the man as he walked. "Who could that be?" he asked aloud, though I'm not sure he was expecting an answer. Neither of us knew who this stranger was, or why he had appeared in the middle of the night in such an odd place. My mind raced with questions, but the answers didn't come. And then, as if everything in the world had just shifted, something impossible happened. The man and his horse, which had seemed so real just moments before, began to vanish. They didn't walk away, they faded, slowly at first, and then faster, until all that was left was a thick, swirling smoke. It was as if the man and his horse had never been there at all. My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel the blood drain from my face as we stood there helpless, watching the smoke dissipate into the night air. Both my grandfather and I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the man and his horse had been moments before. The smoke had completely disappeared, and the night felt eerily quiet. I couldn't wrap my mind around what had just happened. Was it some kind of illusion, or had we really just witnessed something supernatural? My grandfather's eyes were wide with disbelief, and I could feel the panic creeping up on me as well. Without saying a word, my grandfather grabbed me by the arm, his grip tight and urgent. "We need to get back." "Nah," he muttered, his voice low and shaken. I didn't argue, too terrified to ask questions. We started running, our footsteps pounding on the dirt road, the fear pushing us faster than I thought possible. The farther we got from the cornfield, the more the weight of the event settled in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us, following us. As we ran, I couldn't help but think that this wasn't just a random incident. It felt like something out of a nightmare, something I couldn't explain, but somehow knew was real. I had always believed in the supernatural, but never like this, not in my own life. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, as if expecting to see the smoke reappear or that man on his horse. When we finally burst through the door of the house, my grandmother was waiting for us, her face full of concern. We quickly told her what had happened, our voices shaky and filled with fear. She listened carefully, but I could see the worrying in her eyes. After that night, neither of us ever dared to walk through that cornfield after dark again. The thought of it, the thought of that man and his horse disappearing into smoke haunted us, and we knew something unnatural had happened that would forever linger in our minds. After that night, my grandfather and I never ventured near the cornfield after dark again. We couldn't bring ourselves to even talk about it much, not even to search for a rational explanation. There was something in the air, something about that strange man and the horse turning into smoke, that defied all logic and reason. It became something we simply didn't discuss, as if saying the words would somehow make the terror more real. The image of that figure dressed in darkness, mounted on a horse that vanished into thin air, remained with me. It became a puzzle with no pieces, a story that could not be explained. To this day, neither my grandfather nor I have found a reasonable answer for what happened, and in the silence between us the mystery hung heavy, unresolved, a shadow that would never lift. I often think back to that night, to that moment when the world seemed to bend and twist in a way that I couldn't understand. The fear I felt that evening has never fully gone away. The cornfield, which once seemed so familiar and comforting, is now something darker in my memory. I can no longer look at it without wondering what truly lurks there, just beyond the edge of the light. That experience, strange and terrifying, became a part of my life story, a personal legend. Even though the events of that night can never be fully explained, the feeling remains. The cornfield still stands, shrouded in mystery, and no matter how many years pass, I will never forget that eerie, inexplicable moment when the world around me seemed to vanish into smoke. I was about 10 years old when this strange event happened. My parents and I lived on a remote farm, far from any neighbors. It was a quiet, peaceful place, but that night, everything changed. In the middle of the night, I was suddenly woken up by the sound of a horse walking around the house. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but when I heard it again, I realized something was off. The heavy sound of hooves on the dirt floor echoed through the walls, growing louder and closer. My dad, who was always the practical one, got out of bed and tried to make sense of it. He thought it might be a hungry or thirsty horse that had wandered into our yard, but he didn't seem entirely sure. "Maybe it's just looking for food or water," he muttered, still half asleep. But he couldn't ignore the strange feeling creeping up on him. My mom, however, wasn't so sure. She seemed uneasy and told my dad to wait before doing anything. "Let's just listen for a bit longer. Maybe it'll leave," she said, her voice cautious. She didn't trust the situation, and honestly, neither did I. It didn't feel like a simple lost animal. There was something unsettling about the way the horse moved around the house, almost as if it had a purpose. I lay there in the dark, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. The sound of the horse's hooves continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I just wanted it to stop, but instead, it only seemed to get closer. The horse didn't leave, it just kept walking around the house, the sound of its hooves growing louder and more persistent with every passing minute. But it wasn't just the sound that unsettled me, it was the way it moved. The steps didn't sound like the usual calm pace of a horse wandering around. Instead, it was almost as if it was pacing, stopping, and then pacing again, like it was searching for something. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I could feel my palms getting sweaty, and every fiber of my being screamed that something wasn't right. I wanted to call out to my parents, but I was too afraid to make a sound. I could hear my dad and mom whispering, but it felt like the world outside had grown eerily still, aside from the unsettling noise of the horse circling our house. The tension in the room was unbearable. It felt like the air had thickened with every step the animal took. It wasn't just a horse anymore, it was something else, something that didn't belong there. As I lay in my bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature outside wasn't just lost, it was waiting, and that thought alone made my skin crawl. My dad, clearly unsettled by the growing tension, quietly got up and walked to the kitchen. The house was old with wooden doors and windows, and there was no way to see outside unless you peered through a small crack in the door. I could hear his footsteps as he approached, his breathing heavy, but he didn't say a word. I could feel my own heart pounding in my chest as I listened, waiting for something to happen. Just as he reached the door, the sound of pounding fists echoed through the house. It started with the windows. The force of the blows was so strong that it made the glass rattle in their frames. But then the noise became even more terrifying. The punches came all at once, from every direction. The force of them felt like it was shaking the very walls of the house. It wasn't just at one window, it was at every window and every door, all at the same time, as if whatever was out there was trying to break in. The sound was deafening, and it filled the air with such an intense feeling of dread that it was impossible to ignore. My dad froze, staring at the door, his hand gripping the doorknob, as if he were preparing for something worse. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The air was thick with fear, and we were trapped in it, unable to do anything but listen to the relentless pounding that seemed to come from everywhere at once. In a moment of sheer panic, my dad grabbed the machete from the kitchen wall. His hands were shaking, but his grip was tight, and I could see the fear in his eyes as he prepared himself for whatever was out there. His voice broke the silence as he shouted at the top of his lungs, challenging whatever presence was haunting us. "Whatever you are, leave now. There's nothing here for you. Go away." His words echoed through the house, sharp and desperate. The moment his voice rang out, everything stopped. The pounding on the windows ceased, the strange noises disappeared, and suddenly there was nothing but an eerie, suffocating silence. We all held our breath, too terrified to move, unsure if the danger had passed or if something worse was coming. My heart was still racing, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath with us. We waited in the dark, not daring to speak, until the silence became unbearable. My dad slowly lowered the machete, but his eyes never left the windows, scanning the darkness outside for any sign of movement. We all stayed silent, too afraid to even acknowledge the terror that had just gripped us. There was no explanation, no reason for what had just happened, and it left us shaken to the core. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my parents decided to try to sleep, though neither of them could shake the overwhelming fear that clung to us all. The house seemed to be holding its breath, and none of us were brave enough to venture outside again that night. We lay awake in our beds, every creak and groan of the house sending us into a silent panic, knowing that whatever had happened wasn't over yet. Nothing more happened that night, but the fear and the strange events lingered in the air, impossible to shake off. The image of the horse circling the house and the eerie pounding on the windows haunted my thoughts for days. We never found an explanation, no logical reason for why those things occurred. It was as if some invisible force had made its presence known, only to vanish without a trace. As the days turned into weeks, we tried to forget, but the memory of that night never faded. The mystery of the horse, the unsettling knocks, and the suffocating silence that followed stayed with us. We couldn't explain what had happened, nor could we ever make sense of it. The fear that something sinister had been lurking just outside our door never quite went away. Now, as an adult, I still vividly remember the terror of that night. The feeling that something supernatural was at play, something beyond our understanding, still chills me to this day. We never spoke much about it after that night, but the fear remained, silently shaping the way I view the world. Whatever we encountered that night is a mystery that will never be solved, and it continues to haunt me.